Throughout the 1960s, the United States experienced a variety of social movements that were carried out by both the people and the government. In some cases, it was the movement leaders that were responsible for the successes of the movement, and in other cases, it was the action and involvement of the US government that was responsible for the success. Both sides had major contributions to each movement, but there was always one that was more essential to the movement than the other. Leaders of the anti-Vietnam War movement, for example, were much more responsible for the end of the US involvement in Vietnam than the US government. Without a strong public opposition to the war, US involvement would have continued for some time. With SEATO in place, the US had obligations detailed in the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution to assist its members in defending their freedom. Also, the President had the power to continue involvement until the affected area was determined to be peaceful. The US was prepared to take any necessary steps to do so. While SEATO did not provide for military conflicts, it was still used as a reason to escalate US involvement in the war. South Vietnam was not a member of SEATO, but a separate protocol designated it, as well as Laos and Cambodia as subjects of the treaty. The Gulf of Tonkin incident is a prime example of the US government finding reasons to escalate the Vietnam War. The government had its reasons to be involved and wanted to continue the war, but its decisions were met with civilian opposition that included peaceful as well as violent protests, some of which ended in the deaths of several students. This widespread contempt for the war not only tarnished the image of the soldiers at home, but also decreased the morale of the soldiers already deployed. This was exemplified by the sometimes extreme actions of anti-war protesters towards the returning soldiers. The drop in morale was made apparent by the rise in drug use by soldiers and instances of disobedience. Many civilians believed their opposition was the only way to end the war, and that it was their right and moral duty to do so. The Vietnam War was not ended by civilian protest, but was indeed cut short by their efforts. Without an organized civilian outcry, the government would not have tried to find a way out of Vietnam when it did. The anti-war movement was so influential that it affected presidential elections. Robert F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon both campaigned with plans to end the war. Although the government found reasons to continue the war, civilians found reasons to protest it. Civilian opposition is often more powerful than government inclination and is vital to changes in administration and in future decisions. Even if it is the government that makes the final decision, it is the actions of the masses that give the momentum to that decision. Therefore, anti-war leaders played a larger role in the end of the Vietnam War than the US government itself. In the African American Civil Rights Movement, the movement leaders were also responsible for the successes of the movements of the 1960s. These movements, such as the Southern sit-ins, are what caused government action. They actually had a lot of publicity because people were being civilly disobedient in a non-violent way, so naturally people, such as the policemen, didn't want to react in a violent way. Of course, some people did react violently, but all this did was cause more publicity and help the blacks make their point. When blacks and whites started working together for a common cause is when the government really started taking notice. More and more people started thinking, I think it's a good thing what you're doing. And this made more whites realize that everyone really is equal, which caused a huge uproar with others. Which means more publicity, so the blacks' plan is working. But they had to get the movement on wheels so everyone knew what was really happening, which is how the Freedom Rides came to be. They wrote to the President, FBI, and the Justice Department explaining exactly what they planned to do and that they would accept the consequences. So this rose the attention of the government even further. Other movements, such as the March on Selma and the Long Hot Summers, were also attention grabbers, which resulted in things like voting rights. If it weren't for movements such as these, the government would never have taken action as they did. Basically, the movement leaders and the movements are what got the attention of the public and made people actually think, which in turn got the government to take action in the manner that they did. The War on Poverty was another major movement introduced by President Lyndon B. Johnson in his 1964 State of the Union address. Johnson implemented a series of programs known as the Great Society that altogether served two main purposes: the elimination of both racial injustice and poverty. Efforts made to eradicate poverty during this movement were much more prevalent from the government rather than the people. Congress passed a slew of government programs including the Job Corps, Volunteers in Service to America, the Food Stamp Act, and many more. It was, however, the Economic Opportunity Act that these programs were centered around. This act worked to utilize every citizen to the fullest and was essential to the Great Society programs. It is thanks to the actions of the government that these programs were created. The Great Society is similar to FDR's New Deal programs and JFK's New Frontier in the sense that the government was very involved and active. However, as much work as the government may have done in order to control poverty levels, the War on Poverty was often criticized for being an effort to pass more social welfare programs, and many believed it was an ineffective way of dealing with poverty. Overall, unlike the other two movements previously covered, the government was much more responsible for the successes of the War on Poverty. It was essential to creating programs that still exist to this day. In conclusion, these movements, along with many others, exemplify the varying involvement of both the leaders and the government based on the movement. Both sides had different ways and methods of solving the problems that the movements faced, all of which eventually resulted in success. In more cases, however, the movement leaders were the presiding sources of the driving success of the movements. While the government may have made the final decisions to create the programs and acts to make change, it was ultimately the movement leaders and the people that persuaded the government to take the courses of action that it did.